In 1855, the U.S. Army called it a victory, but on those frozen plains of Nebraska, the Sioux called it a curse. As you watch this story, tell me in war who really wins and who's left carrying the memory. Dawn was still a rumor when the cold wind came crawling over the Nebraska plains. It pressed against the grass, whispered through the cottonwoods, and carried the smell of iron and smoke from places no one could yet see. The world was gray and silent. Even the stars seemed to be holding their breath. Somewhere far to the west, a column of horsemen moved through that mist. The clink of stirrups, the soft grunt of mules pulling wagons, the muffled creak of wheels cutting frozen earth. 85 soldiers rode under a banner they could not see in the darkness, following a man whose name already frightened the frontier general, William Selby Harney. They had left Fort Laramie 3 days earlier, their faces raw from wind, their uniforms stiff with frost, their rations frozen in the barrels. Few spoke. Orders were orders: find the Sioux responsible for the Grattan killings. In the language of the army, punishment meant example. To make the plains remember who ruled them. Harney himself said nothing. He rode with his head lowered, one hand on the reins, the other clutching a folded letter from the War Department. It had only one line that mattered: no distinction shall be made between the guilty and the rest. For miles around there was nothing but grass and sky and wind, the kind of silence that feels too big, too alive. Ahead lay a small stream, narrow enough to step across, known on military maps as Blue Water Creek. Beside it, hidden in the valley, a Lakota winter camp, a cluster of buffalo hide lodges ringed by smoldering fires. They were families of the Brulé band, led by Little Thunder. They had come here after the buffalo herds moved south, bringing with them their children, their elders, and the stories of the Great Spirit's breath over the plains. They believed the treaty with the whites still held. No scouts had warned them. No alarm was raised. The sky looked the same as any other day. Inside the village, the morning was slow and gentle. A woman knelt over the fire, stirring a pot of corn and dried meat. The old men sat near the smoke hole, talking softly about the winter hunt. Children chased each other across the snow, their laughter echoing against the frozen earth. The air smelled of ash and pine, of life continuing in small ways. Little Thunder sat outside his lodge, a blanket over his shoulders, eyes fixed on the east. He saw nothing yet, but his body tensed, as though he had. The wind shifted, blowing colder, sharper. He listened. Somewhere in that distance, a sound. Not thunder, not drums, something between the two. He rose and looked out toward the horizon. The color there was wrong. On the ridge above Harney dismount, he stared down at the smoke curling from the lodges, at the horses grazing quietly near the creek. He studied the pattern of movement, slow, peaceful, unaware. To his left, Lieutenant Fleming adjusted his gloves, trying to keep his hands from trembling. "Are they the ones, sir?" he asked. Harney didn't answer. He opened the letter again just to see the words. Authority, it read. Demonstrate authority. His jaw tightened. Form the line, he said. The soldiers spread across the ridge shadows among the rocks. 2 cannons were rolled into position. Powder bags were torn open, shells stacked. The bugler wiped his mouth with a glove, waiting for the signal. Below, a dog began to bark. A woman stepped out of her lodge, looking up at the ridge, only sky, only mist. Then Harney lifted his hand. The bugle split the morning. A sound so sudden, so sharp, it seemed to crack the air itself. The cannons fired. Smoke swallowed the ridge. The shells screamed down the slope and burst among the lodges. The first blast tore through the camp, scattering horses, throwing people to the ground. Panic erupted. Children ran toward the creek, women shouted their names. The air filled with smoke and fire and snow. A private named Merritt would later write in his journal, it was like watching the sky fall. Little Thunder shouted orders, trying to gather what few men could fight. But they were hunters, not soldiers. The wind caught their words and flung them away. Arrows hissed upward and fell short. Another shell burst beside the creek, sending red water high into the air. Merritt wrote again. The river turned dark. It was moving too fast. I thought it was blood. Through the haze, a Lakota girl of maybe 16 stumbled toward the stream, clutching her younger brother. She turned once, just long enough for Merritt to see her face, the shock, the disbelief before a blast threw her forward into the water. Later, they would find her hand still wrapped around the boy's wrist, their fingers frozen together. By mid-morning, the shooting stopped. The valley lay under a thin, gray smoke. The lodges had become black husks. The snow was gone, melted into mud and ash. Bodies lay half buried in the earth, their blankets smoldering. Harney rode down through the silence, his horse splashing through the shallows of the creek. An officer approached, notebook in hand. "Casualties?" Harney asked. "Unknown, sir, but the village is destroyed." The officer hesitated. "Orders for the record." Harney looked once more at the dead, then at the water sliding past their feet. "Victory," he said. That word would appear in every newspaper east of the Missouri. Harney's victory at Blue Water Creek. They would print it beside maps and columns of type, call it justice, call it progress. But the people who lived here would never call it that. For them, it was the day the earth itself cried out. That night, the soldiers camped on the opposite hill. They drank to forget the sound. Some played cards, others sang off key. But when the fire burned low, a wind came off the river. It was colder than before. Men turned their collars up. The bugler, half asleep, thought he heard something, a soft drumming under the ground. He woke his friend. "Listen," he whispered. The other man strained to hear, then laughed. "It's the wind!" But when he lay back down, he could still feel its steady hollow coming from the direction of the creek. The next morning, the horses refused to cross the water. They snorted, stomped, pulled back on the reins. Harney cursed and drove his spurs in, but his mount wouldn't move. He turned away, muttering to himself, "Damn superstitions." Behind him, a young soldier knelt by the bank, washing his hands. When he looked down, the water around his fingers was tinted red. He blinked, startled, and the color vanished. Months later, settlers would arrive, drawn by talk of rich soil. They found the ground fertile, yes, but strangely quiet. No birds sang near the creek. The air hung heavy, as if it carried something unsaid. A farmer's wife wrote in her diary, "The nights are uneasy. Sometimes the wind sounds like crying. Years turn to decades." Grass covered the old campsite, the earth swallowing what the fire had left. But stories survived, whispered through generations, told by those who would not forget. The elders said that the river never froze smooth in winter. Even when the ice thickened, a narrow seam ran through the middle, always open, always breathing. They said it was where the water still spoke. A century later, archaeologists dug here. They unearthed lead bullets, rusted fragments of tin cups, blackened pottery, splinters of bone. Among them lay a copper bracelet, its surface carved with faint, wavering lines. When they cleaned it under the light, it glimmered like something wet. One of them stepped back uneasy. "It looks like it's moving," he whispered. Stand there today, just grass, wind, and sky. The creek slides quietly through the valley, unchanged in shape, but not in spirit. No marker stands to tell what happened. No monument, no sign. Only the sound of wind in the grass, the endless breathing of the land itself. And if you wait until dusk, when the sun bleeds across the horizon, you might hear it faint beneath the water. A rhythm deep and slow, like a drum echoing from the earth's heart. They called it a battle. The plains called it a wound. And wounds remember longer than men. Snow drifted like ash across the basin, thin, dry whispering against the hides of the lodges. The winter of 1855 had bitten deeper than most. Every creek ran narrow, half frozen. Every wind carried dust from faraway storms. The Brulé Sioux had chosen this valley because Blue Water Creek seldom froze entirely, its current running black beneath the ice. The people called it Maka Owangja Wakpa, the river that remembers. It curved through the grasslands like a scar, feeding small pools where horses drank and children played. Their camp stood on the south bank, 32 lodges. In a ring facing east, the entrances turned toward the dawn. Smoke rose straight from the fires that burned it inside, sweet with pine and buffalo dung. Women worked quietly, scraping hides, sewing winter moccasins, drying meat from the last hunt. The sound of their tools was steady and soft, blending with the creak of frozen leather and the crackle of the fires. Outside, young boys practiced with bows, their laughter rising into the cold air. It was the lull between hunts, a breathing space before the deeper snows. Little Thunder sat before his lodge, wrapped in a robe trimmed with porcupine quills, watching the creek. His hair was streaked with silver, now his eyes dark and patient. Around him the world seemed harmless smoke hanging motionless in the air, horses pawing at the snow for grass. Yet something felt wrong. The wind had changed. It blew from the east, from the white men's forts, and it carried a scent that did not belong to this country. Iron, pitch, the ghost of powder. "The earth is listening," he murmured, "but it does not speak." Inside another lodge, Crow Eagle, the medicine man mixed herbs in a small stone bowl. His hands shook as he ground the roots. He had dreamed of a river that glowed red beneath the ice of horses without riders crossing the plains. He told no one. Dreams he knew had their own rhythm. Speaking them too soon gave them shape. As evening fell, the hunters returned from the west with little to show. The herds had drifted beyond sight. They brought stories. Instead, strange tracks pressed deep into the snow, wide like hooves, yet square at the heel, the prints of wagons where no wagons had ever been. The women listened, glancing at the children at the sky. The men grew quiet. Then someone began to drum softly inside one of the lodges, a rhythm to steady the air. The heartbeat of the camp returned for a while, though it was thinner, cautious. Across the ridges beyond sight, the soldiers of Harney's column were setting camp by the Platte. The cold settled into their boots and fingers. Rifles were useless lumps of ice until warmed by the fire. Frost glittered on their beards. They spoke in low voices, passing bottles, muttering about the savages they were ordered to find. To many of them, the Sioux were shadows from the frontier papers, raiders, horse thieves, faceless enemies. None had ever seen the people they would meet at dawn. Harney sat apart from his men near a small lantern. His journal lay open on his knee. The pages were stiff. Discipline poor, he wrote. Morale low, snow heavy. Scouts report village near Blue Water Creek. Will engage soon. He paused, looking toward the west. The stars there were brighter, colder. The wind sounds like drums, he added, then closed the book. Morning on the plains, Boya, was a kind of rebirth, slow, reluctant. The sun crawled over the horizon like a wounded thing. Its light caught the snow and turned the land to silver. From the Sioux camp, thin pillars of smoke marked breakfast fires. Children huddled near the warmth, while mothers warmed stones and pressed them into small hands. Horses blew steam from their nostrils, stamping to break the crust of ice. The hunters saddled up, crossing the creek to check the traps set along the ridge. Beyond the hills, a line of buffalo moved south, dark dots against the light. By midday, the sky thickened again, the color of pewter. The wind sharpened, carrying with it the rattle of distant geese. The elder said that geese flying so low meant change storms, perhaps, or strangers. The dogs began to bark, toward the east, their hackles stiff. Nothing yet could be seen, only the pale shimmer of snow, but the air itself had changed weight. It pressed down on the chest, heavy, breathless. Crow Eagle felt it first. He stepped outside his lodge and raised his face to the wind. In it, he smelled metal. He went to Little Thunder. Something is moving on the other side of the sky, he said. The chief listened, then nodded slowly. Then we will move with care. That same moment, miles away, Harney's men were breaking camp. Chains rattled as the wagons lurched forward. Horses strained, hooves slipping on the ice. The world around them looked dead grass, frozen white streams glazed over. The only sound was the squeal of wheels and the groan of wood. They followed an old buffalo trail that wound toward the Blue Water Basin, the lead scout pointing out faint smoke to the west. Harney lifted his telescope, squinted. For an instant he saw the circle of lodges small and still against the snow. He lowered the glass. We have them. Back in the village, life went on as it always had, but every movement carried a tremor. The women packed dried meat into rawhide bags. Hunters sharpened their arrows, though they did not know why. Children sensed it too, their laughter, thinner eyes watching the horizon. When the wind blew across the creek, it made a low moan beneath the ice. The sound drifted through the camp like a voice calling from underwater. The people tried not to hear it. They built the fires higher instead. As darkness fell, a red glow spread along the far edge of the sky. Not sunset firelight reflecting off low clouds. The old woman who had doubted the treaty whispered a prayer. In the distance, wolves began to howl. The horses answered, stamping restless. The night grew long, and the stars seemed to move faster, sliding across the heavens as if the earth itself were hurrying towards something it could not avoid. The wind came first. It rolled down from the north with a voice that scraped the sky raw, flattening the grass, and carrying with it the smell of men and gunpowder. In the Sioux camp, the dogs sensed it before anyone else. They whined tails, low pacing in circles, glancing toward the eastern ridge where the land rose in pale folds. Above them, the clouds were thin and fast racing toward the sun that had not yet broken the horizon. Frost smoked from the ground. Every sound, every creak of hide, every step on snow seemed too loud. Little Thunder stood at the edge of the creek, watching the line of water beneath the ice. It pulsed like a black vein through the white. Behind him, the camp was waking the smell of smoke of coffee traded from the posts of meat sizzling in the early fire. Children's voices lifted, then fell quiet again as mothers shushed them. He felt the wind change direction. East to west now, it carried something strange, something metallic. He turned his head and saw a hawk circling low, fighting the gusts, its cry lost in the wind. The old people believed hawks brought messages. This one circled 3 times, then flew straight toward the ridge. Far beyond that ridge, the soldiers were already moving. The ground trembled faintly under the weight of their march. Hooves struck the frozen soil with hollow thuds. The 2 howitzers groaned behind the teams of mules, their barrels flashing when the sun finally rose. Harney rode ahead, his scarf drawn tight across his mouth, eyes squinting against the glare. The snow hurt to look at, too bright, too clean. He thought of the letter folded in his breast pocket, the one that told him to punish without hesitation. He wondered if the people below had heard of Grattan, if they knew why death was coming. It did not matter now. The army's rhythm was set. At the foot of the ridge, the lead scout raised a hand. Smoke, thin gray, drifted above the valley. The air carried the smell of burning cedar cooking meat. Through the glass, Harney could see the circle of lodges, small, dark humps against the snow. Figures moved between them, children, perhaps women, bent over the fires. He lowered the telescope and said quietly, "We'll wait for full light." The men crouched behind the ridge, pulling at their collars, stamping their feet. Frost clung to their eyelashes. They could hear the river somewhere ahead, the slow grinding of ice as the current pushed beneath it. It sounded like breathing. In the Sioux camp, Crow Eagle prepared the morning fire. His hands shook as he dropped the first spark onto the dry grass. The flame caught quickly, bright and thin. He murmured a prayer to the 4 directions. "Wakang Thanka, protect us from the storm that has no name." The others heard and fell silent. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed, high and frightened. A hunter came running from the north edge of camp. His face was pale with frost and fear. "Riders," he gasped. "Many. Coming from the hills." Everything stopped. For a heartbeat, only the wind moved. Then chaos rippled through the lodges, men grabbing weapons, women calling for children, dogs barking until the air was filled with noise. Little Thunder climbed onto a rise near the creek and shaded his eyes. The ridge glimmered under the sun, empty. He could see nothing yet. "Maybe it is hunters," someone said. But the chief did not answer. He knew the sound of an army. It was not thunder. It was steadier, colder, the sound of discipline. Harney gave the signal at 8:30. The cannons were unlimbered. The gunners adjusted their angles. Behind them, the infantry formed a line, their rifles gleaming in the light. The order moved down the ranks like a ripple. "Advance!" the bugle called, once shrill and cutting. Men shifted their weight, horses snorted, and the line began to move. Snow crunched underfoot. They crested the ridge slowly, the entire valley spreading before them like an open book. Smoke curled from the lodges below, blue against the white. For a moment, no one fired. The soldiers just stared at the ring of dwellings, the figures running now, the shimmer of the creek that looked almost blue again. Then Harney raised his arm. The first cannon boomed. The shot struck near the edge of the camp, throwing up snow and earth. The second followed, and the valley erupted. The air filled with smoke and the sound of shattering ice. Little Thunder shouted orders, but the words were lost in the roar. Women dragged children toward the creek. Men ran to untie horses to mount and lead them away, but there was no direction left, only chaos. From the ridge, the soldiers saw movement and mistook it for resistance. Their forming lines, someone shouted. More fire. Shells burst among the lodges. One tipi vanished in flame. The wind carried the screams upward, twisting them into thin, high notes that cut through the cold. Harney's horse reared. He steadied it, staring down at the scene. Smoke rose in columns. "Keep firing," he said. The Sioux fought as they could. A handful of warriors on horseback circled the edge of the camp, loosing arrows that fell harmlessly into the snow. The wind drove the smoke back into their faces. Horses stumbled on the ice. A young man named Iron Hand shot once with his rifle, saw a soldier fall, then turned to reload and was struck in the chest. He fell beside the creek, his blood steaming against the frost. His mother saw him from across the water and screamed until her voice broke. Downstream, children hid among the willows, clutching each other. The water beneath the ice glowed red where the current carried the blood. It pulsed under their feet, warm for a moment, then cold again. A girl whispered, "The river is crying." Another told her to be quiet, that it was only the wind. But the sound rose and fell like sobbing. Harney rode forward with the cavalry. The infantry followed, bayonets fixed. Smoke rolled over the ridge thick as fog. Men stumbled through it coughing. Somewhere a horse screamed. The bugle called again, though no one knew why, victory or confusion. The air stank of sulfur and burnt leather. Harney's voice cut through it. "Cease fire!" The echo carried, but not everyone heard. Shots cracked here and there, random like the last sparks from a dying fire. When the smoke cleared, the valley lay silent, except for the wind. The creek ran darker now, half choked with ash. The lodge's smoldered skins blackened and collapsed. The soldiers moved among them, checking for signs of life. They found mostly women and children. One officer turned away sick. Another counted bodies aloud, his voice steady, mechanical. Harney sat his horse and watched, his expression unreadable. He reached into his coat, touched the letter again, and whispered the line he knew by heart. No distinction. Above him, the hawk that had circled earlier drifted back into view, rising higher, vanishing into the white sky. The storm kept its promise through the night. Snow slanting hard from the north, hissing against burned poles, smoothing the valley into a single merciless sheet. By dawn, the drifts lay high against the collapsed lodges, soft as down from afar, sharp as broken glass up close. The world looked clean again, but only because the wind had hidden what it could not heal. Under the new skin of white, the ash still steamed. Under the ice, the creek still moved black steady, carrying bits of a life that no longer had a place to rest. The army column strung itself out along the ridgemen in blue coats, hunched against the cold wool scarves rimed with frost muskets slung low. The wheels of the howitzers squealed until the axles screamed back. Mules balked at the first steep pitch, then leaned into the harness as whips cracked through the air. No one spoke of victory. They spoke only with the rhythm of motion, lift, set, drag, breathe. Lift, set, drag, breathe. When the path narrowed, they went single file. When the sky darkened again, they did not look up. The storm had its own orders: erase the trail behind them, swallow the sound, make the land appear as it had been before the valley burned. Private Merritt rode near the tail, one glove ripped, fingers raw where the cold had found a path. He kept rubbing his thumb against the inside of his pocket, feeling the small curve of copper he had taken from the river, just enough weight to prove his hands were still his. He told himself it was only a trinket, nothing more. Yet every time the column stopped and the wind fell quiet, he would hear a low tapping he could not place, like knuckles on a table somewhere nearby or a drum against the floor of the earth. He swallowed hard and did not take out the bracelet. He did not dare look at it in daylight. Harney rode ahead, the scarf high on his face, his eyes narrowed to slits against the drift. His horse tossed its head at every gust, foam freezing in the corners of its mouth. The general held the reins with steady hands and counted the beats between gusts. 3, 5, 7, waiting for the wind to drop back to 3 again, because numbers were a place to stand when the earth slid. An orderly pushed forward with the leather logbook shielded under his coat. Harney took it, pressed the wet nib to cold paper, and wrote, "Engagement concluded. Enemy dispersed. Examples made." The ink feathered and froze at the edge of the words. He shut the book and did not add what the wind had said in the dark before the guns, because wind leaves no testimony that anyone believes. Behind them, the valley exhaled a long and even breath. The survivors waited until the last scrape of iron, last chain rattle, last hoof thud sank into the distance. Then movement, small at first, careful hands easing aside willow branches, feet testing the crust of snow. A girl crawled out from beneath the undercut of the bank hair, plastered to her cheeks, blanket stiff with ice. Her brother followed, lips blue, eyes bright, because there was still something he wanted to reach, the line of dark brush that meant shelter, to reach the ridge where the wind broke and the world looked different. Their grandmother came last, the baby tight to her chest, face hidden in fur. She had hummed through the night to keep the fever from finding the child's lungs. She would hum until her voice gave out, or the road did, whichever quit first. Little Thunder rose from the snow with the slow care of a man who knows what his body has already given away. The bandage froze to the cut at his brow. When he moved, it pulled. He did not touch it. He watched the creek instead, the seam of open water pulsing black under the glass, then turned to the living and counted. He did not say the number out loud. Counting the dead aloud calls them back to stand in the line. Today there was no room on either side for ghosts. Crow Eagle knelt and scooped up a double handful of snow, threw it onto the remaining embers of the biggest lodge. Steam rose up and vanished. He whispered a short prayer to the four directions, then gathered sweetgrass from a pouch, crushed it between his palms, and lifted the scent to the wind. The wind did not answer, but it did ease. A few of the women moved among the fallen, cutting strips of hide to wrap the feet of those who would walk. A boy found a small doll made of bone and sinew lodged in a drift. He tucked it under his shirt without telling anyone the cold shape against his ribs, a reminder that some things could be carried, even when everything else had been taken. They began north, up through the shallow ravine where the snow lay less deep. Bodies bent against the gusts, heads down, children in the center. Old ones against the windward side because they were stubborn, and because stubbornness is a shelter. Steps cut into the drift, rawhide thongs bound around ankles to keep the snow from stealing heat. The world had narrowed to the space a hand could reach in front of the face. When the gusts backed off, the land opened again, mile after mile of white basin and low brush, the ridge a smudged line the sky, something that pressed rather than floated. The creek followed on their right, its voice muffled under the newest push-knock-shift breathe. The same rhythm as a sleeping body that dreams badly. Wolves shadowed them at a distance, gray marks on gray ground. Bright eyes, the soft confidence of animals who understood winter better than men. The wolves smelled the blood under the ice, the meat left to the snow. They trotted and waited and trotted again. No one threw a stone. The wolves were not the enemy today. They were the plains taking back what the plains always take. The living people moved on, because to stop was to fall, and to fall was to sleep in a way that did not let you wake. At noon, they found a line of cottonwoods where the wind slackened. The children were set under the lowest branches, hands set to work on fire before appetite had the chance to break the body's hold on the world. Dry bark shaved with bone knives, embers stolen from the last small bed of coals wrapped in punky wood. The oldest trick in a land that does not forgive people who forget tricks. A breath. Another. The tiny coal brightening the curl of smoke, the first sound of flame whispering. A woman divided the last strip of pemmican into pieces the size of a thumb. She did not look at anyone as she put food into children's hands. Eyes make the division heavier than it needs to be. The old ones ate after the fire had a voice again. The sky bruised toward evening, a low purple that promised another night of drifting snow. Crow Eagle rubbed cedar between his fingers and touched ash to the foreheads of the children. Just a smudge, just enough to make them feel the line that connects breath to breath. Little Thunder walked the edge of the trees, scanning the distance for any sign of pursuit. A glint, a straight line where no straight lines belong, a shape that refused to be wind. The world was empty except for the wolves and the sound of the creek under ice. Emptier still because of how much had been taken from it. He looked down at his hands and flexed them. They hurt when he opened them, less when he made them into fists. On the far side of that same horizon, the column made camp in a shallow swale half sheltered from the north by a finger of earth. Fires sparked to life under tarps. Coffee hissed into tin cups. The first warmth of the day found men only after they had stopped moving. Merritt sat close to a flame and took out the copper bracelet. Under the firelight, the carved waves looked like they shifted a trick of heat, he told himself. A trick of eyes that had been inside smoke too long. He slipped it onto his wrist for the first time. It was too small. He had to force it past the knot of his hand. The metal was colder than the air. A corporal watched and snorted. "You want to carry their luck home, Merritt." Merritt shrugged. Luck is luck. In the dark beyond the fire, the wind dropped, and that tapping returned a slow double beat, soft as if it came from inside his own chest. He rubbed his wrist until the skin burned. Harney ate without tasting Hand's steady mind, measuring the hunt that would follow when spring made everything audible again. He laid out the map on his knee, traced the run of the blue water with a finger that had held too many pens and too many reins. Find them. Punish them. Teach the country a lesson. The words fit on a page. The world they name did not fit anywhere. He closed his eyes and in the darkness saw the girl by the creek again. Just for a moment, a face the color of ash, a wrist with copper on it. He opened his eyes until the stars wheeled, and the world righted itself, then ordered the bugler to post double sentries. Men sleep differently when someone watches. He had learned that in another war, another country, under a different kind of cold. Back on the northward line, the survivors rose after a few mouthfuls of rest because the wind said, "Move." The old woman with the baby coughed twice, turned her head aside so the children would not see her spit red into the snow, then smiled and told the smallest one a summer story about river grass taller than a pony's back. The boy listened and for a while walked without stumbling, because stories make the legs remember how to be legs. The creek bent left, the trees dropped away, the land opened into a sheet so flat that the sky seemed to kiss it, an illusion born of distance and hunger that can break a person if they stare at it too long. Crow Eagle raised his hand and the lines shifted closer together, bodies making a windbreak for each other. Breath steaming in a single low cloud, the sound of feet a soft morse on the crust. Toward midnight, the storm eased. The stars came out hard bright, endless each one a bone bead stitched to the lid of the night. The temperature fell. The snow squeaked underfoot. Somewhere to the southeast, in a place where the land dipped and spared the wind, the wolves sang a song that was not for men, but reminded men how to stand very still. The people listened and then moved on because moving was the only answer they could give to the night. By morning, the creek had changed voice. The open seam had narrowed, the under-ice current pushing slow. The knock of ice against ice a duller sound. Little Thunder tested a crossing where driftwood had frozen into a trellis, hands first, then a knee, then the weight of a body. The ice groaned and held. One by one they crossed, each person placing a foot in the scar the person before them had made, because a path is a gift the person ahead gives to the person behind. On the far bank a single juniper stood. They cut what they dared from it to smoke the breath of the night out of their clothes. Crow Eagle pressed ash from the small fire into their palms, a line down a line across earth and sky, intersecting in a mark so simple the wind could read it. Behind them, the valley finished cooling. Carrion birds found the first edges of what the snow had hidden. Magpies chattered on black poles as if scolding the wind for sloppy work. The creek carried into a bend, the kind of small debris that holds a day together when life is normal, twisted thong, a child's toy frame. A strip of quill work made strange now because there were no hands left to want them. Tracks leading out of the basin had already faded. The storm had done its duty with the thoroughness of a clerk, strike, strike, strike. As if the land had decided to keep its own records this time. Out on the trail, Merritt dozed, and woke and dozed again in the saddle, the bracelet a cold circle biting into skin that felt too big for his bones. He dreamed the wind was water, and the water was voice, and the voice said his name the way only a mother says it. He jerked awake with a sound that made his horse pitch sideways. The corporal swore, steadying him with a gloved hand. "Keep your head, Merritt." Merritt nodded, swallowing air that did not want to be swallowed. Over the ridge ahead, the sky broke blue for the first time since the guns. It was the kind of blue that makes the word blue in Bluewater Creek a lie, because that blue belonged to the sky, not to anything that touched the earth. For the Sioux, the line of cottonwoods that afternoon meant shelter, meant the chance to boil snow into water that did not bite, meant a moment when the children could sleep without their legs moving. They built the fire, low hid in the smoke, pinned under branches. The old woman laid the baby near the warmth and laid her own hand beside his to show him how to open his fingers toward heat. When he did, she laughed quiet, fierce. Crow Eagle held the last of the cedar and did not burn it. The smell alone was enough to say the words he needed to say. Little Thunder walked beyond the trees to where the world spread out again and closed his eyes. He spoke the names of the lost under his breath, not to call them back but to line his chest with them, so the wind would not get inside and live there. Evening came with a brittle pink that turned quickly to iron. The wolves held distance. The creek curved away from its own name and slid into brush. The people moved again because north was not a direction anymore. It was a shape that looked like survival. And somewhere behind them, under ice that would not keep still, the river carried the weight of a copper circle missing from a girl's wrist, and the heat of a fire that had used up a village, and the sound, always that sound of something that remembers, even when men decide not to. The plain lay under a new kind of silence, heavier, fuller, as if the world itself were waiting for something to exhale. Morning broke pale and thin, a dull light spilling across the frozen hills, turning every snowdrift into a mirror. The air was sharp enough to cut breath into ribbons. The cold was no longer a presence, but a weight pressing against skin, slipping into bones, tightening around the heart like wire. And yet, through that white stillness, a small line of people kept moving, north-bent figures against the wind, wrapped in hides leading horses that stumbled through the crust. The wind had scoured the land bare again. It carried no scent now, no smoke, no blood, only emptiness. But the people still felt watched. Every gust seemed to whisper, "Go, go, go." Little Thunder walked at the front, face turned into the wind eyes, narrowed to slits. He was no longer thinking of Blue Water Creek. That name had already become a scar. He thought only of distance of how far the body could go before it became part of the snow. His breath came slow and even, clouding and vanishing with each step. Behind him came the children walking in the prints he left behind. The rhythm of survival passed from one heartbeat to another. Crow Eagle walked near the center, leaning on his staff. The copper bracelet hung from his pouch, now wrapped in a scrap of hide. It seemed to vibrate faintly when he touched it. He told himself it was the cold, but deep down he knew the plains did not forget. The land carried everything: footprints, voices, the last breath of the dying, the smoke of every fire ever lit. Even now, somewhere under their feet, the sound of that day's gunfire was still echoing, traveling through layers of frozen soil like a heartbeat that refused to stop. They reached the foot of a ridge by mid-morning. The slope was steep, but the trees above promised shelter. The snow there clung to the branches in heavy clumps, forming a canopy of white. When the sun broke through the clouds, the whole ridge shimmered like glass. "There," Little Thunder said. "We will rest there." The climb was slow. The horses slipped, snorting, their flanks heaving. The children's hands went numb from clutching the ropes. One boy fell to his knees halfway up. His sister pulled him by the arm until he stood again. When they finally reached the top, the view opened wide, a horizon stretching farther than sight. To the east, the plains rolled smooth and endless. To the west, the black hills rose faintly blue and soft like smoke. The wind up there carried both directions, the memory of what was lost, and the faint scent of pine from the mountains. They built a small fire behind the ridge, out of sight from the open land. Crow Eagle struck the first spark with a flint stone and whispered to the flame in Lakota wake gently. "The wind is watching." The smoke curled upward in thin gray strands, carrying the smell of pine resin and sweetgrass. The warmth spread slow, fragile, but it was enough. The people crowded close, rubbing their hands, feeding the fire with bits of dried bark. The old woman with the baby finally spoke. Her voice was soft, hoarse. "We are not meant to die here," she said. No one answered, but everyone nodded. The sound of the fire was like breathing steady, alive. As the day passed, they began to talk again. Quietly at first, in fragments. They spoke of names of the horses lost, of the songs that had vanished in the smoke. The children listened, their eyes wide, as if memorizing every word so the wind couldn't take them too. When evening came, Crow Eagle told a story, the one his grandfather had told him when he was a boy, long before the treaties, long before the forts. He said that once the plains had been ruled by wind alone. It moved freely, singing through the grass, unchallenged. But one day the wind grew lonely. It went to the river and asked for a companion. The river said, "I cannot leave my path." The wind said, "Then I will carry your voice." And from that day on, every gust that swept the prairie carried the sound of running water. That is why Crow Eagle said, even when there is no river near, you can still hear the earth breathing. The firelight flickered across their faces. For a few moments, they looked not like fugitives, but like people again. People with stories, with roots. Above them, the stars began to appear, one by one, burning, steady, unblinking. Far to the south, the army had made camp along the Platte. The soldiers huddled under their tents, half asleep, half haunted. Harney sat by his lantern, staring at the open page of his journal. The words he had written the day before stared back victory at Blue Water Creek. He dipped the pen again, but his hand hesitated. He wanted to write what the reports could not hold: the smell of the burning hides, the sound of the woman screaming at the water, the way the river had turned red and refused to freeze. Instead, he wrote only one line. "We did what was ordered." When he looked up, the candle flame bent in the draft. He thought he heard something, a faint thump, low and steady like a drum played far away. It was so quiet he could have imagined it. He rose, stepped outside the tent. The night was clear, the stars sharp as glass. The river below shone like a strip of steel. Nothing moved. And yet, the rhythm was still there, just at the edge of hearing. Thump, Thump. Thump. Harney's throat tightened. He pulled the coat tighter around him and went back inside. The sound followed him for a long time before it finally dissolved into the wind. Back on the ridge, the Sioux had fallen asleep. The fire had burned down to coals. Little Thunder sat awake again, staring north toward the faint line of the Black Hills. "We will reach them," he said to himself. "If the earth still loves us, we will reach them." Crow Eagle stirred beside the embers. "The earth loves everything," he murmured. "It is only people who forget." A sudden gust of wind swept across the ridge, carrying with it a sound like distant singing. The embers flared, glowing bright for a heartbeat, then dimmed. The people did not wake, but their bodies shifted closer together, as if they had all felt the same invisible hand brush across their dreams. When dawn came again, the sky was streaked with red. The wind had died. The snow glistened untouched. They rose, gathered what little they had, and began walking once more north, always north. The creek had vanished now, buried under ice and distance, but the sound of it remained in their ears. It followed them like breath, like memory, like a voice that refused to be silenced. And somewhere far behind them, deep beneath the frozen plain, the water moved again. Slow, dark, patient, carrying ash and bone and copper, whispering its endless refrain to the listening earth. The next morning dawned thin and brittle, the air biting through layers of hide and cloth, as if it were searching for skin. The survivors of Blue Water Creek rose slowly, every motion deliberate, every breath a small act of defiance against the cold. Their world had become a rhythm: wake, walk, breathe, endure. Each footstep into the snow felt heavier than the last. Yet the earth beneath them seemed to whisper, "Keep moving, keep breathing, I remember you." The ridge fell away behind them, and the plains opened once more, vast, empty white. The horizon looked endless, yet to the north, the faint shape of the Black Hills rose like a mirage. Somewhere beyond those dark outlines there would be shelter trees, the promise of safety. But the distance was still measured in suffering, and the wind was not finished testing them. Little Thunder walked at the front again, his coat stiff with frost, his eyes swollen from days without sleep. The sun reflected off the snow, blinding white, making him squint until the world blurred into light. He thought of the ancestors, how they had crossed this same land, long before soldiers, long before borders. They had walked not as fugitives, but as part of the earth itself. He wondered if the earth still recognized them now, or if too much blood had been spilled for it to remember their names. Behind him, Crow Eagle kept close, the copper bracelet wrapped in hide still tucked under his robe. He could feel its faint warmth, a pulse that didn't belong to the weather. He had stopped questioning it days ago. Every night when the fires died down, he heard it hum softly like a drum far away, or a heartbeat buried underwater. The sound comforted and frightened him all at once. By mid-morning, the wind began to rise again, sweeping across the prairie in long, low waves. Snow lifted in veils, twisting and falling, erasing their tracks as fast as they made them. The world behind them vanished with each gust, as though the land refused to keep a record of what had happened. The people leaned forward, heads bowed, faces wrapped in fur, eyes half closed against the sting. The horses trudged, ribs showing breath steaming from their nostrils. The smallest children were carried wrapped in blankets, silent and still. The sun disappeared behind clouds. The light changed, no longer white, but the color of pewter. The air grew thick, heavy, with the weight of snow waiting to fall. Crow Eagle lifted his head and sniffed. "Another storm," he said quietly. Little Thunder nodded. "The last one buried our dead," he said. "Maybe this one will hide our living." They reached a shallow basin just before dusk, a place where the ground dipped and the wind slowed. Sparse willows grew along the edge, their branches bending under frost. It was not much, but it was enough. They stopped there, forming a circle as they always did, setting down what little they carried. The older women gathered brushwood, scraping the bark with bone knives. The men dug a shallow pit in the snow, piling rocks around it to hold the fire. When the first flame caught, it flickered weakly in the gray light. The smoke rose straight up, a thin black line against the sky. Crow Eagle knelt beside the fire and laid the wrapped bracelet near the heat. The hide hissed faintly as the frost melted. He unwrapped it slowly, holding it in his palms. The copper had darkened to a deep reddish brown, the carved lines along its surface still sharp, still trembling as though the metal itself remembered motion. He looked into it for a long time. In the reflection of the fire, he thought he saw a river black and wide with light beneath the surface. He closed his eyes and the hum grew louder. "You have something that belongs to them," the wind seemed to whisper. He opened his eyes and turned to Little Thunder. "This is not ours," he said. The chief looked down at the bracelet, then at Crow Eagle's face. "Nothing is anyone's," now he replied. "Everything belongs to the land." The storm reached them by nightfall. It came like a slow breath, then all at once. The wind howled through the willows, bending them low, driving snow sideways across the camp. The fire fought to stay alive, hissing, spitting sparks into the dark. The people huddled close, covering the children with blankets and hides, whispering prayers to spirits older than memory. The world disappeared into white. The sound of the storm drowned everything: the breath, the heartbeats, the creak of leather, the crack of branches. Only the firelight remained flickering inside the circle like a heart trying to keep its rhythm. Inside that narrow ring of light, Crow Eagle began to sing. His voice was thin at first, almost swallowed by the wind, but he kept singing. The melody wound around the crackle of the fire, the cries of the storm, until it became something larger, a sound not of one man, but of the land itself remembering. The others joined in, one by one, their voices low, rough, tired, but steady. Together they filled the night with sound not of mourning, but of defiance. The wind screamed, and still they sang. When the storm finally passed, the world was unrecognizable. The snow had buried everything: the fire, the tracks, even the trees. The people dug themselves out slowly, shaking snow from their hair and clothes. The sky above them was a pale, washed-out blue, and the air was still. The land looked untouched, as if nothing had ever happened there. But beneath that new layer of purity, the dead still slept. They moved again, heading west now, toward the faint blue of the Black Hills. The sun climbed higher, its light cold and merciless. The land began to rise under their feet, the slopes steeper, the air thinner. The wind carried a new scent, pine, distant but real. The children lifted their heads, sniffing. The trees, one whispered, "The trees are coming." For the first time in days, Little Thunder smiled. "Yes," he said. "The trees remember us." By evening, they reached the edge of the forest. The first pines stood tall and dark, their needles glinting with frost. Snow clung to the lower branches, heavy and white. The air beneath the trees was warmer, stiller, filled with the smell of sap and bark. They built their fire there beneath the sheltering arms of the forest, and for the first time since Blue Water Creek, they felt the weight of the sky ease. Crow Eagle placed the bracelet on a flat stone near the flames. "Here," he said, "we will leave it." The others watched as the firelight danced across the copper, making it glow like living metal. The carved lines shimmered, and for a moment it seemed the bracelet pulsed. A faint sound rose from it, a hum, deep and low, like the murmur of distant water. The children gasped, but the elders did not move. Little Thunder nodded. "The river has found its way here," he said. "It followed us." Crow Eagle lifted his hands and began to speak softly to the night, to the trees, to the spirits that moved between them. He told them of the valley of the smoke, of the people who had fallen, and those who had endured. He told them of the soldiers, of the cold, of the sound of the river that refused to freeze. He spoke until his voice cracked, and then he fell silent. The forest answered not in words, but in sound. The wind moved through the pines, deep and resonant like the echo of drums. Snow fell from the branches in soft cascades, landing gently on the fire. The sparks rose and vanished, and in that moment something shifted. The air itself seemed to change, lighter, calmer, as if the land had accepted what had been given back to it. The people sat in silence, listening. Somewhere far below them, buried under miles of snow and soil, the river kept flowing. It whispered its story to the stones, to the roots, to the sky. A story that would not die, not even when all who had lived it were gone. The Black Hills rose out of the horizon like a mirage, turned solid blue shadows in a sea of white edges, softened by distance and snow. The wind that had chased them across the plains slackened. They're confused by trees that broke its stride. For the first time in weeks, the survivors heard something other than emptiness. The creak of frozen trunks, the whisper of pine needles shedding ice, the faint knock of a woodpecker, somewhere high above. Life small, hidden, but alive. They entered the forest slowly, each step sinking into drifts that reached the knee. The horses' hooves made dull thuds, steam rose from their flanks. The air smelled of resin and wet bark of old wood and smoke. Beneath that scent lay another earth rich and dark, a reminder that the world still had depth. The people moved between the trees as though stepping into a cathedral. Their breath came softer, reverent. Little Thunder stopped beside a fallen pine. He laid a hand on the bark, feeling the grain cold under his palm. "Here," he said. "Here the wind forgets how to shout." The others nodded relief, flickering through exhaustion. For days the horizon had been nothing but sky and snow. Now the land gave them walls, a roof, a place where sound could settle. They built camp in a shallow clearing bordered by spruce. Fires sprang up quickly, small, careful, surrounded by stones. The children gathered sticks, the women unpacked what little food remained. When the first pot began to boil, the steam rose straight and white, vanishing among the branches. The sound of it, the hiss, the bubbling, felt miraculous. It was the sound of normal life, fragile but real. Crow Eagle crouched near one of the fires, his breath frosting the air. From inside his pouch, he drew the copper bracelet again. In the forest light, it looked almost black, the carved lines, faint but unbroken. He held it over the flame until the metal warmed, then set it on a flat stone. "The river followed us," he said quietly. "It wants to see where we end." No one answered. They were listening to the wind moving through the trees, a low murmur that sounded too much like voices. Night came slowly under the pines. The world beyond the trees glowed faintly blue with starlight, but inside the clearing it was all shadow and firelight. The air grew heavy still. The snow outside their circle shone like glass. Every crack of wood in the fire made them glance toward the dark half, expecting to see movement there. An animal, a spirit, the past itself walking toward them. Little Thunder sat beside the largest fire, watching sparks climb into the dark. "We should have a council," he said. "Not of war, of memory." One by one they gathered men, women, the few elders left, the children half asleep. Crow Eagle began to speak first, his voice rough, low. He told them of the river that refused to freeze, of the way the land had swallowed the smoke, of how the wind had turned from friend to judge. "The soldiers think they have won," he said, "but they have only woken something older than themselves." He pointed to the trees, to the black sky beyond. "The plains do not forget. Every hoofprint, every scream, every spark, it all sinks into the earth. The snow will melt, and the grass will grow over the bones, and one day strangers will ride here and ask why the ground feels hollow. They will not know, but the wind will." Silence followed. The fire popped. An ember drifted up, glowing like a slow star before vanishing. Then the old woman with the baby spoke. "My granddaughter was there," she said softly. "She ran toward the water. I saw her fall. The river took her. When I dream, I see her hair moving under the ice. I think she is still trying to breathe." The others lowered their heads. Crow Eagle picked up the bracelet and held it toward her. "Then she is here," he said. "She followed us." The woman reached out a trembling hand but did not take it. "If I touch it," she whispered, "she will never stop following." Crow Eagle nodded and set it back on the stone. The copper gleamed once, catching a line of light from the fire. Outside the ring of warmth, snow began to fall again. Slow, lazy flakes drifting through the still air. Each one caught the firelight for a heartbeat, then disappeared into the dark. The world seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere deep in the forest, an owl called long and low, the sound echoing between trunks like a warning. Harney's men camped miles to the south, heard the same wind that night, though they did not know it came from the same storm. The general sat alone again, the map spread before him. His fingers traced the lines of rivers, the small X marking Blue Water Creek. He thought of the warmth of that water, of the way the ice had refused to close. He had told himself it was science, an underground spring perhaps, or some quirk of current. But now in the long quiet he wasn't sure. The land here did not behave like other lands. It breathed. It remembered. And he who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of forgetting found himself unable to turn the page. Merritt sat near the sentry fire, the copper bracelet still on his wrist. It no longer bit. It pulsed faint and steady. He rubbed it absently, staring into the flames. "You hear that?" he murmured to the corporal beside him. "Hear what drums?" The corporal frowned. "That's the wind in the trees." Merritt nodded, though the wind was gone and the rhythm remained. Thump, thump, thump. In the Sioux camp, the same rhythm rippled through the air, the muffled beat of snow sliding from branches, the echo of something larger. Little Thunder lifted his head. "Do you hear it?" he asked. Crow Eagle smiled faintly. "It is the Earth's heart. It beats slower than ours." They listened together, the sound rising and fading like breath. It was not thunder, not war drums, not memory alone. It was everything at once, the voice of the river under ice, the pulse of the soil, the sigh of wind through pine needles, the sound that connects all things that live and die on this land. Crow Eagle lifted the bracelet once more and placed it at the edge of the fire. "You belong to the water," he said, "but your voice belongs to us." He let it fall into the coals. The metal hissed, flared, then settled glowing red. A smell rose sweet, metallic, familiar. For a moment, the flames changed color, blue, the color of the creek. The people drew in breath. The fire did not burn brighter or louder. It simply changed tone as if a new voice had joined it. Above them, the sky cleared. The storm had passed. The stars came out more than they had ever seen before, each one reflected in the snow like twin worlds. The night felt endless yet gentle. The fire burned low, the copper slowly fading back to its natural hue. Little Thunder stood and looked north. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go to the mountains. We will build new lodges there. We will tell what happened here, and our children will carry it farther." He turned to the others. "And when the wind comes from the south, it will bring their voices with it." The snow melt came late that year. Even by the first full moon of spring, the drifts still clung to the shaded hollows, stubborn and gray, refusing to let the ground breathe. When the thaw finally began, it came all at once, a roar of unseen streams, breaking loose beneath the crust, the first true sound of life the plains had heard in months. The river at Blue Water Creek swelled quickly, eating its way through the old ice, carrying branches, bones, and black ash down from the valley. The smell of wet earth filled the air, rich, heavy, almost sweet. It was as if the land, after holding its breath all winter, had finally exhaled. But the water did not run clear. Men who rode the trail from Fort Laramie said it moved like smoke under glass, dark, slow, alive, in a way that made horses uneasy. They said the current seemed to whisper when it bent around stones, not like wind or water, but like something that had learned words and forgotten them again. Some refused to camp near it at night. Others did out of curiosity and left before dawn with pale faces and no appetite for talk. By then, the Army had written its final word. The engagement at Blue Water Creek was over, recorded, archived, filed among the small wars that mark a continent's slow devouring. The officers who had been there received promotions. The dead were buried without names. The valley was marked on a map as a victory. The paper smelled of ink and dust and permanence. But the land itself had other records written in burned soil, in the altered course of the river, in the strange warmth that still lingered under the ice. Harney left the frontier that summer. He did not return to the plains again. Those who saw him in the years after said he aged quickly, his eyes dark, his hands unsteady when he wrote. He spoke rarely of the campaign, and when he did, he used the same phrase over and over. "We did what was ordered." Yet on sleepless nights, servants heard him pacing, murmuring to himself in a low voice, as though answering someone no one else could hear. Merritt lasted longer in the ranks, but not in spirit. He carried the copper circle, still it had fused to his wrist, so perfectly that even the regimental surgeon could not cut it free without tearing flesh. The skin beneath had gone pale, almost luminous. He said it hummed sometimes, especially when rain fell or thunder rolled over the plains. Once in a saloon in Omaha, he told a stranger that it wasn't a curse but a heartbeat, the land's own, given to him by mistake. When the stranger laughed, Merritt walked out into the storm and was never seen again. In spring, when the river rose high, settlers found a soldier's hat tangled in reeds near the old creek. Inside it was a single copper band gleaming faintly through the mud. For the Sioux who had escaped north to the Black Hills, the world turned quietly. They built new lodges among the pines, hunted elk, and raised their children on stories that began with the same words, "When the river would not freeze." Each generation added its own verse. Some said the creek was guarded now by spirits of those who fell there. Others said it was alive because the land had drunk too much blood and could no longer rest. The elders said neither was wrong. They called the place Mni Sha Wichasha Yuha, the water that keeps the people. In winter, when the cold grew sharp enough to split wood, the young ones were told never to speak loudly near the rivers. "The land listens," the grandmothers would warn, "and it remembers everything you say." Some nights when the wind came from the south carrying the dry taste of old smoke, they would gather around the fire and listen. The younger children swore they could hear drums distant and low like a heart still beating under snow. The older ones said nothing. They had learned that belief was not required for truth. Years turned into decades. The frontier crept farther west. Forts became towns and towns became names on maps that changed with every treaty. The story of Blue Water Creek faded from reports and speeches. History polished it into a line of text. A decisive engagement securing peace in the Nebraska Territory. But the earth did not polish its memories so easily. Each spring, when the river rose, it brought up small things, carved bone beads, arrowheads, bits of blue cloth, a rusted buckle, a human tooth, the color of ivory. Farmers plowing near the old creek found the soil darker. They're richer, almost oily. Crops grew tall but twisted. When they cut the stalks, they said the sap smelled faintly of smoke. In 1877, a surveyor mapping the region wrote in his journal that his compass needle spun erratically when he stood on the ridge above the valley. His horses refused to drink from the creek. At night, he dreamed of a woman singing in a language he did not know. When he woke, the sound of running water filled the tent, though the creek lay half a mile away. He left before finishing his measurements. His entry ends with one sentence: "The river is wrong here." The next spring, a party of Lakota hunters returned to the site. They found the water still open, flowing dark beneath a thin skin of ice. Crow Eagle's grandson, now an old man himself, knelt by the bank and dipped his hands into the current. "It's warm," he said softly, "like breath." He sprinkled tobacco into the water, a gift to the spirits. Then he looked up and saw a hawk circling high above the valley wings, steady against the wind. He smiled. "They have not left," he said. "They only changed shape." That summer, a drought swept the plains. Rivers shrank to trickles, ponds turned to dust. Only Blue Water Creek kept flowing slow and black steam rising from it at dawn. Travelers came from miles away to fill their buckets. They said the water had a strange taste, metallic sweet, unforgettable. Some claimed it healed burns and fever. Others said it caused dreams that made sleep impossible. The people of the nearby town began to avoid it, muttering that the place was unlucky. And yet when the wind blew through the valley, it carried a sound, soft, rhythmic, the faint echo of drums under the earth. Even the most skeptical would pause listening, unsure whether the noise was real or just the wind remembering. Generations later, long after the soldiers and chiefs and elders were gone, the story found its way into books again. Historians argued over the numbers, how many dead who fired first, what treaties led to what revenge. But none of their maps marked what mattered most. The water still ran warm in winter. The wind still whispered names no one could translate. And sometimes on the anniversary of the battle, travelers on the old trail swore they saw light rising from the valley. Blue light, faint as breath drifting above the snow before fading into dawn. They called it the river's lantern. The Lakota said it was the spirits keeping watch. Scientists said it was swamp gas, the slow exhalation of decaying roots. But those who had heard the stories knew better. They said it was memory itself, the land breathing out what it had taken in a soft glow for those willing to see. When night falls over Blue Water Creek now, the valley looks ordinary. The grass grows tall, bending with the wind. The river glints in the moonlight. But if you stand there long enough, if you listen beyond the rustle of the reeds, you might hear something else, the faint hum beneath the world. The pulse that began that winter morning in 1855 and has never truly stopped. It moves through the soil, through the water, through the bones of the earth itself, whispering the same refrain. Empires fall, names fade, the land remembers. And when the wind sweeps across the plains cold and endless, it carries their story still woven through the breath of every hill, every blade of grass, every drop of water that refuses to freeze. They say history belongs to the victors, but Blue Water Creek never belonged to them. It belongs to the soil, to the wind, and to the spirits that never left. Tell me, who do you think history really belongs to?